All right, so get this. It took like 18 centuries, 1800 years for the number of practicing Christians just to kind of creep up to 2.5% of the world's population. And that was by 1900. And then boom, in the next 110 years, that number just explodes to 12% by 2010.
That's a massive jump. Like, what happened in that short period of time to create such a surge in growth?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, this incredible progress of the Christian faith all over the globe and, the huge challenge of reaching everybody, all the different people groups out there. And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of finishing the task, the Unreached People's Challenge.
Ah, classic.
Classic. It is, yeah, by Ralph D. Winter and Bruce A. Koch. And they're not just, armchair theorists here.
Oh, no, not at all.
Winter was a missionary himself for years, right? He even went on to found some pretty key mission organizations.
Yeah, really influential in missiology.
And Koch, he's also got decades of practical mission experience behind him.
So they're really bringing both the theological understanding and that real, on-the-ground practical experience to the table.
Exactly. So you, the listener, you can think of this as like your crash course. Okay, we've boiled it down to the core ideas, saving you the time and effort of slogging through all the details yourself, but hopefully giving you those aha moments, right?
The Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, exactly. The Cliff Notes, yeah. And our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is, well, first, to really just get a sense of how incredible this growth actually has been.
That's a great place to start.
Yeah, but then just as important, we have to also deal with what Winter and Koch call the tragic reality, the billions of people who still don't have a meaningful, real access to this faith.
How can we even begin to reconcile that? This huge growth, but billions still unreached. It seems like a paradox.
It does seem like a paradox, and that's really at the heart of why this deep dive is so important. So let's just start with the good stuff, the amazing progress of the gospel. I mean, right now, just to put it in perspective, 1 out of every 8 people on this planet identifies as a practicing Christian actively involved.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is where these believers are, the book points out that there are actually now more believers in what we used to think of as the mission field.
Those places where missionaries were sent.
Right, more believers there than in the countries that traditionally sent the missionaries, so it's completely flipped.
It's like the mission field is now sending out missionaries.
It's a total shift. And the growth in certain regions, it's just mind-blowing. Like Latin America, for example, Protestant growth there is more than 3 times the natural population growth.
So it's not just about birth rates then?
Not even close. It's people actively choosing this faith.
That's amazing. And it seems like we hear similar stories from all over.
Oh, yeah. China it's hard to even fathom. They went from about 1 million believers to over 80 million in less than 50 years.
And a lot of that growth, from what I understand, has happened quite recently.
Very recently, yeah. So something powerful is definitely happening there. And then you look at Nepal, just a few decades ago, back in the 80s, it was this Hindu kingdom, very small Christian community, often persecuted.
Yeah, very difficult circumstances.
But now, hundreds of thousands of believers, and they've got churches springing up in, get this, over 100 different people groups. And all this just since the 80s.
It's amazing how quickly things can change.
It really is, but as Winter and Koch point out, we can get caught up in all this good news, the incredible growth.
And lose sight of the bigger picture.
And the bigger picture is that even with all this progress, there are still billions of people who are essentially cut off, and the book explains it really well. They say the gospel tends to spread most easily within those existing cultural connections.
Makes sense. I mean, people connect with those who speak their language, understand their customs, share their worldview. It's natural.
Exactly. But it becomes much harder for that message to kind of jump across those divides.
Especially when you have historical tensions and prejudice thrown into the mix.
Especially then, yeah. It's like culture and identity and religious belief, they're all so intertwined.
Absolutely. It's not just a matter of, intellectually accepting a set of ideas. It's about belonging. It's about your place in the community.
It's about who you are. And to help us kind of wrap our heads around all this, the book introduces these 2 scales, the E scale and the P scale. So think of the E scale as measuring the cultural jump a Christian might need to make to share their faith.
Okay, I like that, a jump.
Yeah. So E0, that's the easiest. You're talking to people within your own church, same background, no jump at all. E1, a little bit of a hop, reaching out to people in your own culture, but they're not in church. E2, now we're getting into a little bit more of a jump, right?
Yeah.
Crossing into a culture that's kind of similar, but definitely some differences.
And I'm guessing E3 is where we really get the long jump.
Exactly. That's sharing the gospel in a culture that is vastly different from your
That's
own.
like a whole different world.
Whole different world. Yeah, and then the P scale, that flips the perspective. It's looking at it from the person hearing the message. So how far would they need to travel, culturally speaking, to actually become part of a church?
Okay, so P1 is like, there's already a church right there within their own people group that gets it, that speaks their language, understands their culture.
Exactly. It's a natural fit. P2, they might have contact with similar cultures where there is a church, but it's not their own. Still a bit of a stretch.
And then I bet P3 is they're looking around and all they see are churches that are just completely foreign.
Totally alien, yeah, filled with people who seem totally different from them. And that brings us to the whole definition of unreached peoples. And the book is very clear. These are groups where there's not a church, not one that's made up of people from their own culture and language.
You know, a community that they can easily join where they would feel at home.
Right, like instantly at home. And here's the thing. 40% of the world's population lives within these kinds of groups.
That is a huge number of people.
Huge. And it's important to note that unreached doesn't necessarily mean they've never heard of Jesus, right? They may know the name. They might even respect him.
It's more about the absence of a community, a church community, that really makes sense in their context.
That they can just step into and feel like, yeah, this is us. This is where I belong.
Without having to, like, completely reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
You know, face rejection from their family and community.
Without becoming an outsider.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the book gives this great example from the Bible, Cornelius.
Oh, yeah, Cornelius.
He's a devout man, feared God, right? But to really become part of those early Jewish believers.
He had to take a pretty drastic step.
Yeah, adult male circumcision, not a small thing.
Not a small thing at all. Ouch.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about belief. It was about overcoming a huge cultural barrier, and then they bring it into the modern context. They talk about a Muslim Turk, and you can imagine from a young age they're hearing to be a Turk is to be a Muslim.
Right, it's almost synonymous.
Totally. And Christianity that might be associated with, historical enemies, outsiders, for them to become Christian, it could be seen as betraying their family, their community, even their whole national identity.
Yeah, that's way more than just a change of religion. That's a change of everything.
It's a complete identity shift, and it's just this huge reminder that cross-cultural mission, it's so much more than just translating words.
Absolutely. It's about navigating those deeply ingrained cultural narratives, those historical wounds, the whole context.
Yeah, and it's in that context that we have to look at Jesus's words in Matthew 24:14. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.
Powerful words.
Powerful words. And the key here is that the nations Jesus was talking about, those weren't necessarily countries in the way we think of them today.
It's more about people groups.
Yeah.
Ethnicities, languages, families.
Exactly. The original Greek word ethne, it refers more to all those distinct peoples of the earth. And what's really important to grasp here is that the task God's given us, it's actually seen as completable.
Okay, so it's not about counting every single person on the planet.
Not about the exact count, no. It's more about ensuring that the opportunity to hear and respond to the gospel, it's there for every single people group. And when they talk about the gospel of the kingdom, they're not just talking about individual salvation.
Yeah, it's bigger than that.
It's bigger. It's about, Christ's victory over evil. It's about setting people free to live under his rule, his loving rule.
And I guess the most powerful expression of that is communities of believers within each people group living out their faith.
That's the ultimate goal. And to tackle this huge task, right, the authors lay out 4 different ways that mission leaders think about people groups for strategic planning.
Okay, love a good framework.
Me too. So first up, we've got blocks of peoples. And these are like your broad, high-level categories, give you that big picture, global view.
So like the 10,000-foot view.
Exactly. And there are 2 main models here. One way is to categorize people based on the main religion in their group. So you've got your Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, ethno-religious.
Okay, kind of like a religious map of the world.
A religious map, yeah. And that helps us kind of gauge the scale of the task, like how many resources do we need, where are the biggest needs.
Makes sense.
Then the other model is called affinity blocks, and this one comes from Patrick Johnstone. He's grouping together people groups that are very closely related based on shared languages, history, culture. Think like the African Sahel or the Arab world.
So like huge regions with shared cultural DNA.
Exactly. And this model, it's really useful for those big strategic collaborations between mission organizations. They can kind of team up and share resources
Right.
and knowledge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Collaborate and conquer, right?
Collaborate and conquer. Exactly. Okay, so that's blocks of peoples, the big picture view. Then we zoom in a bit and we get ethno-linguistic peoples.
Okay, so getting more specific.
More specific, yeah.
Yeah.
So here we're talking about an ethnic group that's united by this shared identity, ancestry, history, customs, and really importantly, language.
Language seems to be key here.
Crucial, yeah. And they give the example of the Laz people in Turkey. They have their own unique language and even some distinct physical characteristics that set them apart.
So it's about really being able to identify a specific group of people.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting because sometimes what looks like one ethno-linguistic group, you look closer and it might actually require multiple approaches.
Multiple approaches. How so?
Well, they tell this great story about Cameron Townsend, the guy who founded Wycliffe Bible Translators. So he's working with the Kaqchikel people in Guatemala, and he discovers that one Bible translation just won't cut it.
Oh, wow. Why not?
Because they had 6 different written dialects. Can you believe it?
6. So they needed 6 different translations.
They did, and that was just for the written word. Imagine if they were using audio recordings, those even finer dialectical differences, they would be so important.
It's amazing how language can be both unifying and dividing at the same time.
It really is, and this just highlights how vital language is for understanding and communicating the gospel accurately. I mean, even small variations can create these huge barriers.
It's not just about getting the words right. It's about getting the heart of the message across.
Exactly. And the good news is there have been some awesome collaborative efforts among mission researchers in recent years to develop these really comprehensive lists of ethno-linguistic peoples, and that's been a game changer.
So we've gone from that 10,000-foot view to a much more detailed map.
We've got a much better map now, which is so helpful for prayer, for raising awareness, and for that initial strategic planning.
So we've got blocks of peoples for the big picture, ethno-linguistic lists for pinpointing specific groups. What's next?
Next, we zoom in even further, and we get socio-peoples.
Okay, now we're getting granular.
Granular. I like that. So these are smaller, more informal groups, people who share a common interest, activity, occupation, thing like women who gather at a river to wash clothes, taxi drivers at a stand.
Oh, or like college students in a particular major.
Yeah, or even recent immigrants from the same area. They form these natural communities.
I guess this is where you start to see the real-life connections.
Absolutely. And this approach is super valuable for that initial outreach, starting a Bible study, a prayer group within these already existing communities. It's a natural way to build relationship.
Meet people where they are.
Meet people where they are, exactly. And it can be a real stepping stone towards establishing those more permanent churches.
So building trust, building relationships first.
Building that foundation, yeah, but they do caution against focusing on certain socio-peoples too early, like, for instance, starting with children. In some cultures, that could be seen as, undermining the parent's authority.
Yeah, that could backfire.
It could. So it's about being sensitive, being strategic, and always remembering that the long-term goal is planting those churches.
Okay, so that's 3 approaches. We've gone from the global to the regional to the local. What's the 4th one?
The 4th one, this is the one they see as crucial, absolutely critical for actually finishing the task, and it's Unimax peoples.
Unimax peoples. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So think of it this way. It's the largest group of people that are unified enough so that the gospel can spread naturally within that group like wildfire without hitting these big internal barriers.
So they're unified enough that the message can just flow freely.
Flow freely, no obstacles in the way, and the 1982 Lausanne definition of a people group, it sums this up really well. The largest group within which the gospel can spread as a church planting movement without encountering barriers of understanding or acceptance.
That's a pretty tight definition.
It is, and it's so important because while unreached peoples, that often refers to those larger ethno-linguistic groups, right?
Yeah, the big category.
And Unimax peoples, that helps us zero in on those smaller, more culturally tight-knit units where church planting movements can actually take root.
So like within a larger group, there might be these smaller Unimax peoples that are the real key.
The key to actually seeing the gospel flourish.
Right.
And they point out that smaller, isolated communities, like, some jungle tribes, they often already are a single Unimax people. But when you get into these bigger, more diverse societies, it gets a lot harder to pinpoint those Unimax groups.
Does the lines get blurrier?
They get blurry, yeah. And language is a factor, but it's
Yeah.
not everything. Religion, social class, education, politics, historical grievances, customs, all of that can create these big divisions within a larger group.
Wow, so many factors.
So many factors. And they use the example of India. You've got all these languages, dialects. Then you add in the divisions of religion and the caste system. And what might look like one big group on the surface is actually made up of thousands of distinct peoples.
It's like a whole universe within a country.
A universe, yeah. And then you've got animosity between groups that are right next to each other, like the Somali clans. Those rivalries run so deep that even if they share a language, you might have to approach them separately.
So starting with that common ground of shared identity, even if it's a shared history of conflict.
Even if it's conflict, yeah. And of course, the hope is that as people come to Christ, those divisions will start to heal. And they point to the example of the Scandinavian tribes. Historically, they were always at war, but after they converted to Christianity, they were able to unite.
So the gospel can be a powerful force for reconciliation.
Super powerful. And that's really what the Unimax approach is all about. It's about breaking down those internal barriers, whether they're linguistic, cultural, social, historical, so that the gospel can spread naturally within a specific people.
And making sure no one gets left behind.
No one left behind, exactly. And they do acknowledge that trying to count Unimax peoples precisely, that can be a real headache.
I can imagine with all those nuances.
Right, because those sociocultural barriers, they're not always obvious to outsiders, but the real value of this definition, they say, it's not in getting that exact number, it's in being sensitive to the realities on the ground, what helps and what hinders the spread of the gospel.
So being aware of the complexities, the layers.
Being aware, so you don't accidentally overlook a group that's hidden within a larger category.
Right, because a group can be labeled reached.
Yeah.
Based on the majority.
Yeah.
But there might be these pockets within that are still completely untouched.
Exactly, and that leads us to what they call the essential missionary task, which is establishing a church planting movement, but not just any movement. It has to be viable, indigenous, and it needs to have the power to transform societies.
So let's break that down. Viable meaning you can stand on its own 2 feet.
Self-sustaining, yeah, and indigenous, meaning it's not seen as something foreign, imposed from the outside.
It's got to be rooted in the local culture.
Deeply rooted, and a church planting movement that's one that keeps multiplying, reproducing new churches generation after generation.
So self-replicating.
And they actually call this a missiological breakthrough. It's that moment where the faith takes on a life of its own within a culture.
It's like it's finally clicked.
It's clicked, yeah. And they say the task is basically done when even the people outside the church, they recognize that this movement is a genuine expression of their culture.
Like it's become part of the fabric of who they are.
Yeah. It's woven in, yeah. And at that point, the love of Jesus, it can really start to flow freely throughout that whole people group. And Donald McGavran, he called this people movements to Christ.
Like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And then they make this distinction between regular missions, which is working in places where that breakthrough has already happened.
So the groundwork has been
The
laid.
groundwork's there, yeah. And frontier missions, which is in places where it hasn't. So you're talking about intentional cross-cultural evangelism just to get things started.
Like the pioneers going into uncharted territory.
The pioneers, exactly. And then there's this idea of missiological closure, which basically means achieving that initial breakthrough in every single people group.
So like checking off the list,
Right.
every people group has that foundation.
Every group. And in the 1970s, there was this growing realization that, hey, this might actually be possible, which led to that whole a church for every people by the year 2000 movement.
Ambitious goal.
Ambitious it was. And while they didn't hit that deadline, it did create this incredible momentum, this global focus on reaching those who hadn't been reached yet.
It really shifted the mindset.
It did. And it's important to remember here that there's a difference between the ongoing task of evangelizing every single individual.
Which never really ends, right? You people are born all the time.
Right, it's an ongoing thing versus this more focused, achievable goal of a church for every people.
Where the focus is on getting that self-sustaining movement going.
Exactly. And the progress, it's been pretty remarkable. Estimates suggest that back in 1976, there were something like 17,000 unreached peoples.
17,000. Wow.
And today, that number's down to around 8,000.
Still a lot, but a huge decrease.
A huge decrease, yeah. And there are all these amazing people and organizations working tirelessly to see that number go down even further. And they talk about these tools that are being used, things like the church planting indicator, which is this scale that tracks progress, and the Joshua Project. They have these classifications like unreached, least reached, formative, emerging, growing church.
So like different stages of progress.
Different stages, yeah. But they also warn that this data, it often operates at that ethno-linguistic level, so it doesn't always capture those Unimax nuances.
Right, because you can have progress in one part of a larger group, but other parts are still completely untouched.
And that's a real danger. We can't get complacent and think, oh, there's a church there, we're good. Because there might be these pockets within that group that are still totally unreached.
So it's about constantly looking deeper, not just checking off boxes.
Constantly digging deeper, yeah. And one of the most important takeaways from all this is that achieving a church in every people, that's just the beginning. It's not the end game.
It's like laying the foundation.
It's the foundation, yeah. And they connect this to Jesus's prayer for God's kingdom to come, his will to be done on earth, and the vision of all nations declaring God's glory. It's much bigger than just buildings and numbers.
It's about transformation, right, of
Yeah.
individuals, communities, whole societies.
Transformation, and they're not afraid to call it what it is. They say the challenge of unreached peoples. It's a spiritual battle.
Yeah, you can't ignore that dimension.
Absolutely. And they talk about the need for what they call power encounters, recognizing that there are these forces at play that are holding sway over entire groups.
Spiritual strongholds.
Spiritual strongholds, yeah. And while it's a spiritual battle, they also emphasize that we need to be smart about it. Careful planning, strategic thinking, thorough training, all of that is essential.
Ephesians 6:12, right? Put on the full armor of God.
Exactly. And the core instruction, the bottom line, it comes back to Matthew 28:19. Make disciples of all the peoples, and that's what we need to keep front and center as we move forward.
With both faith and obedience.
With both, and recognizing that God's plan, God's perspective, it's so much bigger than ours.
We're just catching glimpses.
Just glimpses. And they acknowledge, they're very honest about how complex this all is. It requires our best effort, our creativity, our willingness to sacrifice. But at the end of the day, our data points, our projections, those are just tools.
They can't replace that personal connection with God.
They can't. And that's ultimately what matters most. And to help us kind of visualize this whole thing, quantify the progress, the book includes all these charts and graphs.
I love a good visual.
Me too. And they really highlight the role of modern researchers, organizations like the Joshua Project. They're doing amazing work gathering and analyzing this data. And it's important to note that when they categorize groups by their main religion, it's really just a cultural marker, not necessarily a statement about every individual's beliefs.
Right, like a reached Muslim people group can still have a majority of Muslim population.
Exactly. It's just a way of broadly categorizing. And one of the most striking things you see in these charts is what they call the Great Imbalance.
The Great Imbalance? What is that?
So the vast, vast majority of people who are living in unreached groups, they belong to the Muslim, ethno-religious, Hindu, and Buddhist blocs. That's where the greatest need is.
So that's where we need to focus our efforts.
That's the priority, yeah. But the encouraging thing is they're also seeing some real breakthroughs happening in these historically resistant blocs, which makes you wonder if maybe it's not so much about resistance.
But about finding the right approach.
Maybe, yeah, like maybe we just haven't figured out the most effective way to connect with these groups yet.
So there's hope, even in the most challenging contexts.
Absolutely, there's hope. And then another imbalance that they point out is in the deployment of missionaries, only about 10% of evangelical missionaries are actually working among those unreached people groups.
10%, that's it.
That's it. The vast majority are working in groups that are already considered reached.
So a reallocation of resources might be in order.
Might be, yeah, because we have the people, we have the resources. It's just a matter of, are we putting them in the right places?
Prioritizing the unreached.
Prioritizing, exactly. And despite the challenges, they do express a lot of hope. They emphasize the progress that's been made, the momentum, the percentage of the world's population living in unreached groups. That's actually been significantly reduced.
That's good to hear.
And they believe that if we keep this focus, if we really ramp up our efforts, we could see the establishment of the body of Christ in every people group in our lifetime.
In our lifetime. That would be incredible.
Incredible. It would. And another key point they make is that missions is becoming increasingly global. More and more missionaries are coming from Asia, Africa, Latin America.
So it's not just the West sending missionaries anymore.
Not anymore. It's becoming this truly global effort. And that requires new partnerships, recognizing the value of what's been learned throughout history, but also being open to new ways of doing things.
Collaboration and mutual learning sounds like a powerful combination.
It really is. And when you look at it in terms of numbers, the remaining task, it seems a lot less daunting. They estimate that there are about 1,000 churches worldwide for every remaining unreached Unimax people group.
1,000 churches for each group.
1,000. So we have the people. It's really about mobilizing them, raising awareness, getting them engaged.
So it's not about converting billions. It's about reaching thousands of groups.
Thousands of groups, yeah. And that just feels so much more doable. And they end the book by reminding us of that beautiful picture in Revelation of people from every nation, tribe, people, and language gathered together in worship. And the hope is that we can all be a part of making that vision a reality.
What an inspiring way to end.
So listener, just to kind of sum it all up, the Christian faith, it's experienced this amazing global growth, something truly remarkable. But the reality is there are still billions out there who live in unreached people groups without access to a church that makes sense in their culture.
And we've seen how understanding the different approaches to defining and reaching these groups, especially the idea of Unimax peoples, that's crucial if we want to keep making progress.
Absolutely crucial, and hopefully we've given you some food for thought, some aha moments along the way.
Yeah, and one final thought to leave you with. What if we shifted our focus from just individual conversions to really cultivating these organic, culturally relevant movements of faith? What would a real missiological breakthrough look like in all those different cultural contexts?
Such a great question, and even more importantly, what unique role could you, the listener, play in this global effort, even if you don't feel called to be a missionary in the traditional sense?
Yeah, we can all be a part of this.
We all can. And if you're interested in learning more, getting a better understanding of specific unreached people groups, I highly recommend checking out the Joshua Project website. They've got tons of great information, really inspiring stories. And remember, the story is still being written. We're all part of it. And the question is, what role will you play?
That's a powerful question to end on.
I think so, too. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
Take care.
Bye-bye.